have trans people in the team, what does it teach? It teaches that people are okay to discriminate against people. It's okay to make exceptions to the rule. Not everybody's included. And so it creates a big vacuum for trans people. They don't have the opportunity that everybody else has.
Sure. No, it's certainly understandable. Thank you for being here today, and I'm sure we'll be returning to you with a number of questions. So thank you.
Okay, thank you for having me.
Yep. Dr. Lungarini, how about you? Will you talk a little bit about yourself and what brings you to speak with us today?
Thank you for the opportunity to join you today. This is certainly a journey and a topic that is near and dear to myself in particular and us here at CIAC. As you mentioned, we've been involved in, I think, one of the most high-profile transgender and Title IX lawsuits here in Connecticut, and continue to fight for what we believe is right for our kids in Connecticut and for inclusion across the country as well. Myself personally, I have a background as a elementary, middle school, and high school teacher, as a administrator from a athletic director, assistant principal, and principal perspective at the high school level, and coaching experience from the middle school, high school, and collegiate level, where I was a Division I coach for a number of years. I think my background as with a master's degree in human performance and exercise physiology gives me a good understanding of the different dynamics of sports, and then also building upon that, I just recently completed my doctoral dissertation with the focus of that dissertation research on transgender inclusion at the interscholastic level. So, this is something that we've within our office and me personally have been very dedicated to understanding over the past 3 years. This is my 4th year in my position here as executive director of the CIAC. And, just to echo some of Diana's points, I mean, when we look at interscholastic athletics, particularly education-based high school sports, there's about 7.3 million kids across the country that participate in high school sports. And research from the NCAA level will show you only about 6% of those kids go on to play at the collegiate level, and only 2% of those kids go on to play professionally. So, we really have to keep in perspective what the purpose of education-based athletics at the high school level is, and that is to develop meaningful relationships, to have positive role models in our life, to have connections to school and community. And anytime we're creating policy that infringes on the opportunity for any student athlete or any student to make those connections, we're really doing a disservice to our kids. So we spent a lot of time, looking at the arguments that have been made. Happy throughout the course of today's presentation to share with you some of the data and research we have, particularly on Connecticut, and the misconceptions that are placed out there of physiological advantages that transgender female athletes may have. Happy to share with you as well some of the data that we've collected that shows the performance in Connecticut. Of the 9 bills in 2021 that have been enacted into law that excludes transgender, most of those cite Connecticut, and what they're citing Connecticut is not accurate. And so we're happy to share with you the true story of Connecticut and why inclusionary policies are effective not only in our state but are necessary across the country.
That's great. Thank you, Doctor. I appreciate that. And Mike, if you would introduce yourself and what brings you here today.
Good morning. My name is Michael Roberts. As George said, I'm an attorney at the Commission on Human Rights and Opportunities. And while we at the CHRO, we enforce all of Connecticut's anti-discrimination laws based on all of the many protected classes that we have in Connecticut. My personal and professional interest has been in LGBT plus rights, and kind of my life has kind of in strange ways kind of paralleled the evolution of the area in terms of protections for sexual orientation and gender identity in Connecticut over the past few decades. My family moved here when I was a kid, not long after anti-discrimination protections for sexual orientation were first enacted. It wasn't specifically because of that, but just happened to time parallel to that. Around the time that Connecticut had its first state Supreme Court decision that implicitly affirmed certain protections for sexual orientation, I, as a closeted kid who didn't even really wasn't even really aware of his identity and what it meant, was being called gay for the first time in elementary school, in a way that, while I didn't quite know what it meant, certainly clearly felt personal and was intended to be an insult at the time, and has kind of stuck with me for a long time. A few years later, when the U.S. Supreme Court was striking down laws that criminalized consensual relations between individuals of the same sex, it was around that time that I was having to have a homophobic slur cleaned off my school locker, and had to tell the school administration whether it was intended particularly for me or if it was just a word that happened to end up on my locker. And it wasn't long after Connecticut passed marriage equality that I came out, and not long after Connecticut enacted anti-discrimination protections for gender identity and gender expression, that some of my very close friends began fully and openly expressing their gender identities to me. A lot of these parallels I've only learned from the work that I've done and the history that I've learned after the fact. I didn't often know at the time that these protections were being put in place, or that many of the legal battles to gain protections through the courts were happening. And part of that is because while it usually takes a legislative body or a court to enact protections, it ultimately takes many organizations, many entities, many individuals to make the promise of those laws a lived reality for everybody. And that underscores the importance of making sure that we spread the word about what protections and obligations exist, and that organizations like the ones that we have represented on this panel and those represented in our attendees here today continue to do our part to put protective and inclusive policies and practices in place. So I'm very excited to talk about kind of what the state of the law is, kind of the journey that has led us here, and kind of what some of the issues are that we're focusing on at the moment.
Thanks, Mike. Appreciate that. I'll come back to you, Diana, for a moment. Normally, one of the arguments that we hear and is that there's a lack of fairness if trans athletes are included in high school sports. And the NCAA and Connecticut, a lot of times when you read that their advice on the topic, there seems to be this kind of balancing test between fairness and inclusion. How do you respond to that? How do you think that plays a role in this, if at all?
Well, for children, between boys and girls is pretty much the same until they go to puberty, and that's when the changes start. And so really there's no difference all the way up to age 10 or 12. But past that, if they're on hormone blockers, it keeps them on an even field. They're, for all athletes, there comes in different sizes and shapes. Some are tall, some are short. What about a tall woman in a basketball game? Do you compromise them, saying, well, you're too tall, you can't play in this team? So we look at very much differences, and I think that for trans people there is really no difference. All we hear in the news are those that win, but there's so many that don't win. They're just there to play. And that's the thing I think we have to bring out, is the fact that it is equal, and not every trans person is winning. It's only those few that actually come out and win. And they're the ones who make the headlines. You know, Texas just passed a law banning all trans sports, people to be in sports. I believe the governor signed it yesterday or today. You know, and they only have 1 or 2 people in the whole state that are trans athletes. And so why pick on us? What does it do to a child who all of a sudden is told they can't play in a sport because they're different from other people? You know, differences should not be grounds for rejecting somebody from a sport. So kids come in all sizes and shapes, you know, and trans people come in all different sizes and shapes, and we shouldn't be discriminated against because of who we are.
And what do you think the impact of that lack of inclusion is when it's there?
Well, I think if you look at the data, for trans children, they have a very high suicide ideation rate. But when they are accepted in sports, in school, and stuff like that, it drops down to a normal level of suicidal ideations. You know, for us, it's to be affirmed our gender identity. To be able to do things in our gender identity is there, and it affirms our true gender. You know, so when you tell somebody they can't do something, you're saying you're different, and we don't want any differences. We want everybody the same.
Oh, thank you. And Doctor, I'll pivot to you now for a moment. In your introduction, you mentioned that there were misconceptions and data and research that's happened in Connecticut that you would, you know, be interested in fleshing out. Could you do that for us?
Yeah, I think one of the data points that goes right along with what Diana was just talking about, in our case in particular, a lot of attention was paid to 2 athletes who had some success in sprinting events here in Connecticut. As you know, as Diana mentioned, the percentage of athletes, transgender athletes across the country is very small. So, you know, even thinking it doesn't even reach a threshold of having impact. But in Connecticut, when we looked at the time frame of those, the 2 athletes who were named in the lawsuit, they ran in 14 female state open sprint events. In those 14 events, 65% of the first place finishers in those events were cisgender females. 85.7% were second place and third place finishers, and 95.9% were cisgender female finishers. So the transgender female participants respectively won 5% of the first place rankings, 2% of the second place and third place rankings, and 4% of the fourth, 10th place rankings. The data and evidence is very clear. There is not a domination by transgender female athletes at the, particularly in our case. When we look across the country, we don't see a domination of transgender female athletes, because as Diana said, you know, you're, especially at the high school level, you're just getting into, you know, that puberty state where you may start to see some of those physiological differences, but there are so many other factors that come into the performance at the high school level that, you know, the physiological difference alone does not, in my opinion, separate, you know, create a separation that is a significant advantage or disadvantage.
Sure. So where do you think this narrative of dominance is coming from? What do you think it's rooted in?
You know, if in our case in particular, it's rooted in one race. It's rooted in the 2019 indoor 55-meter race where the 2 transgender female athletes took first place and second place, and oftentimes that is a race that's pointed to that suggests that there's domination. And as you shared, there's a perception that that this takes away from scholarship opportunities or other opportunities for kids. First of all, high school state athletic associations don't offer college scholarships, so you know, we're not taking anybody's opportunity away. The NCAA universities offer scholarships, and they are well within their rights to offer scholarships to anybody that meets the recruiting criteria established by the NCAA. In that race in particular, where they target the first, second, and third place rankings, where first and second were transgender female athletes and third place was cisgender, female athlete. When we look at those times, the winning time in Connecticut was actually the 14th nationally ranked time that year. The second place time was the 20th nationally ranked time that year. The argument of the third place time that is being argued that that should have been the first place time, and by not being ranked first in Connecticut, not being that 55-meter champion, that you're losing opportunities. Well, that time was the 122nd ranked time that year. In fact, there were runners from other states. The 10th ranked runner from Virginia, the 4th ranked runner from Maryland, all ran faster times than that third place finisher in Connecticut. So, if you're a college recruiter and you're looking at sprinting times and you have one spot open, are you going to take the 122nd ranked runner, or are you going to take the 10th race runner? And that's where we need to keep in perspective what high school athletics is about, how recruiting takes place, and it does not have any impact on the inclusionary practices of keeping LGBTQ plus kids involved in high school athletics.
Well, thanks for sharing that. And that a phrase you just used was interesting to me, and it was what high school athletics is about. And to me, from someone who's not involved in it directly, I would think that an education component of that is inherent to high school athletics. Could you talk a little bit about what high school athletics is about?
At its very core, high school athletics, education-based athletics, are an extension of the school curriculum. So, we are not separate and parcel from your school day. We take the values and the skills that you're learning in school. We extend that through sport experiences. We take the passion that students have for the sports that we play, and we apply those skills and those curriculum development goals through the lens of sport. So, through sport, we're looking at how do you find ways to collaborate and communicate together? How do you build meaningful relationships? How do you develop your teamwork skills? How do you think critically to solve problems? And we do that all through the lens of interscholastic athletics. It's not just limited to sports. The same exists in all of your other extracurricular activities. When you're involved in band, in theater, in the debate club, you're extending those learning objectives and goals of the district and of the board to these opportunities that are connected with your school. Yes, there's winners and losers, and in sporting events, and yes, there's championships and records that get, because that's the natural progression of sports, and that's the natural outcome of sporting events. But if you look through, I believe, any Connecticut athletic handbook, and you look at their mission statements, if you look in the CIAC handbook, our purpose and our mission statements, you're not going to find the word win. It's not about winning and losing. It's about those skills, those lifelong skills and relationships that are developed through sports. That is the purpose of high school and education-based athletics.
Thank you, Doctor. And I'll ask you, Diana. I think we just heard a really important definition of what high school sports is about, what scholastic sports are about, and that's fundamentally that's what we're talking about today. How do you view trans athlete inclusiveness as being part of that mission that Dr. Lungarini just explained?
Well, I think it's very important. Like I said, it builds team spirit, working with others, leadership skills. And, it's not about winning. It's about being in sports and being able to enjoy high school. For me, I didn't go into sports. I was a member of the science club. But through the club, I generated a lot of friendships. I knew a lot of stuff that I brought through my lifetime. And the same thing with sports. You bring things through your lifetime because of your high school experiences. If that experience is discrimination, what's it going to do to a trans person? If they tell you can't do this, even though you love sports, you love doing sports, and you're excluded, that's going to create a lot of depression for students, for trans students. They're going to feel rejected by other teammates. And so you have to build inclusiveness. I think that's the important thing. Is high school is all about inclusiveness, and for trans people, without that, they really lose a lot of learning experience in high school.
Sure, sure. No, that's certainly understandable. And what value do you think it brings to, if any, to the people on the team or the club, or, in this case, we're talking about sports, so the team that aren't trans? I mean, it seems like it would be an opportunity for everyone. That's important.
Right, exactly. And, for the other teammates, they get to meet a trans person. And one of the things we know is when you know a trans person, you don't have discrimination. You like, same thing, race and nationality. When you have inclusiveness, you have a better understanding of people. And by separating people, you're saying these people are different. We don't want anything to do with them. And that's bad.
Sure, sure. I don't know, either Mike or Dr. Lingrini, if you want to speak on either of those topics, or that we kind of were just talking about.
Mike, do you want to jump in?
The value of inclusiveness. I mean, that's sort of what I'm revolving around with this part of the conversation. Because to me, I would think, and in my own personal experiences, the more diverse an experience and the more inclusive an experience I have, as you said, Diana, I think it was so plainly and well said. When you interact with people who are different than you, you don't discriminate. So that is, I think a fundamentally important thing. So yeah. I'll go. Yeah, sure, Diana, go ahead.
One of the things that we learned that just by being ourselves, it shows so much to other people. It's just amazing how if you know a trans person, you're less likely to be against them. And that is what it boils down to.
Absolutely. I see, Doctor, that we're having a tech problem with Mike. So feel free to give your take on it.
Sure, absolutely. I think one of the other, pieces that we need to, consider as well is at the high school level, the overwhelming majority of participants are minors. And so, we are in a process where, in a position where, these kids are developing their identities, they're developing executive functioning skills. So there's a lot of development that's going on at these ages. And when you don't have inclusionary policies, or you have policies that, put kids in decisions to make decisions, particularly when it comes to their bodies, we're really doing that at this point out of anecdotal fear of participation of transgender athletes, and we don't do that in any other aspect of education. In fact, all other aspects of our board policies seek to prevent kids from using substances, or educate them on not putting things in their body that may have significant impacts to them. But when it comes to this major life identification and decision, policies that aren't inclusive may be forcing kids to make a decision that they might not be ready to make, and there's no need to have them do that. That is, again, one of the ways that we can affirm our student athletes and our kids to be accepting of who they are, and give them the safe space and the opportunity that they need to fully inform, to make the decision that's best for their life. And it shouldn't be the pressure of sport that pushes somebody to make that decision.
Well, thank you, Doctor. And I'll ask a question for you again before we get back to Mike, who I think hopefully can talk now. But I'll ask you kind of a follow-up. What exactly is Connecticut's rule on trans athlete participation right now? Is there a hormone blocking component of it? Is it simply a gender identity issue? Can you switch back and forth from the boys team to the girls team as you see fit? Where is Connecticut actually stand right now with the rule?
Yep. So our policy right now is an inclusive policy. There's no HRT component to it. So if as a student athlete, you are making the transition, it's really the responsibility of the school district to work with the student, work with the adults in their life as well to affirm that this is truly the manner in which the student lives their life. So whether it's transitioning from male to female or female to male, what we seek from the school and their work is that that this is truly how the person is living their life. And once that is established, then the student athlete is identified as the gender that they are living their life, and that's the gender of team that they participate with. So we don't have a hormone requirement for it. Again, with the majority of student athletes in Connecticut being minors, we don't feel that that's appropriate to force that position. Again, I think inclusionary policies, if this is the way that an individual is living their life, then being accepting of that and allowing sports, which is a major way that students identify and express themselves and who they are, should not be limited on any basis. And I believe our policy honors that.
Great, thanks. Mike, I'll turn to you now, especially since you can talk again. That'll make it easier. A lot of the background that we're talking about here, the race that the doctors brought up and some of the narrative of dominance, a lot of that's coming from the Soule case that's going on in Connecticut right now. Could you talk a little bit about the state of the law in Connecticut? And I know the Soule case will probably be an important part of that, but kind of the state of where we're at right now and with the law regarding trans athletes in Connecticut.
Definitely. So the Soule case that you referenced is currently in federal court, and what the basic gist of that case is, in terms of what it's trying to bring to the attention of the courts, is whether Title IX, the federal law, which in many ways requires equal opportunities to be afforded based on sex, whether that requires that in athletics, that any kind of sex segregated teams be based on a person's assigned sex at birth, regardless of what their gender identity is. And the way we see that play out kind of in a strict kind of assigned sex at birth way is in a law like Texas, that says that however you identify, that doesn't matter. It's whatever whatever the sex is that you were born with, that is what constricts, limits, and decides the way that you can participate in athletics. And so what the plaintiffs in that case are trying to argue is that Title IX requires that sex segregated teams be aligned in that way. The CHRO has gotten involved in that case. CIC is involved in that case, and a couple of other school districts are involved in that case, and 2 trans athletes in Connecticut are involved in that case. And our position is that no, that Title IX doesn't require that athletic participation be defined based on your assigned sex, that it can and does encompass and take account for a person's gender identity and permit individuals to be able to participate in accordance with their gender identity. Now that's something that's playing out in federal court about a federal law. And that will continue. Right now, the case is at the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, which is kind of the mid-level court in the federal court system. It wouldn't surprise me if at some point this issue about kind of what Title IX requires and how it should be interpreted in this area ends up at the U.S. Supreme Court, but we're not there yet. But whatever happens at that level, Connecticut has a lot of overlapping protections that will hopefully, presumably, still remain in place going forward to ensure equal opportunities in schools and in athletics. One of those, going back to what Glenn was saying before about kind of the ways that people can identify and kind of the freedom that they have to identify in Connecticut. Connecticut has a definition of gender identity that does not require any specific steps before you can begin identifying in a particular way, expressing yourself in a particular way, and acting in accordance with your gender identity. It's really however, whatever someone's sincerely held kind of core belief is about what their identity is, whether it's cisgender, transgender, whatever their gender identity is, it's really about the person and kind of how they identify, how they feel. Obviously, there are ways that you can demonstrate that, the ways that you kind of express yourself, certainly in some instances, undergoing some kind of medical gender affirming process, such as taking hormones. That certainly is one way that you can demonstrate that, but it's not required. You don't have to kind of change your driver's license or your birth certificate gender marker in order to have that. It's really how you yourself identify. So Connecticut allows that, and offers that space for people to identify, with respect to their gender, how it makes sense and how it's what's true to them. In schools, there are a couple different statutes that ensure equality of opportunity and equal protections. One is Connecticut General Statutes 10-15C, and if you want, I can put it in the chat if anybody wants it kind of written out. And that is specific to public schools and educational opportunities, and requires that students be afforded equality of opportunity on a variety of different protected classes, including gender identity and gender expression. And that would encompass things like the school, environment itself, and the educational kind of opportunities that are being provided there. But as was mentioned before, kind of that also includes other activities, interscholastic opportunities and activities that would encompass athletics. Schools are also in what, to use the legal term, what are called places of public accommodation. That term is most often historically meant to encompass things like hotels. You think accommodation, public accommodation, transient areas, taverns and things like that from a century or more ago. But it encompasses a lot more than that. Connecticut has a really broad definition for what constitutes a place of public accommodation. In some more kind of commercial spaces, that can be something like your, as we see in other kinds of litigation, your bakery, your flower shop, your wedding venue, but it also includes public schools, which open their doors to the general public in a variety of contexts. But for students, open their doors to the students that are entitled to go to a particular school in a particular district. So in that context, as places of public accommodations, schools cannot deny students or anybody full and equal accommodation on the basis of a protected class like gender identity. And then lastly, we have a statute that the CHRO enforces, 46A-58, which is kind of a broad, what courts have called the fundamental civil rights statute in the state of Connecticut. And what that statute does is make it a violation of state law that can be enforced by the CHRO to deprive anyone of rights secured by some other statute, including under a federal statute. So what does that mean? If you have a statute like, for example, Title IX, that secures certain rights for somebody, and those rights are deprived by someone else on the basis of a protected class, including gender identity and expression, that can become a violation of state law. And violation of that particular statute that the CHRO can then enforce and adjudicate. So you have these overlapping protections that exist, this kind of almost like to use the school context, a Venn diagram, so to speak, where they all kind of meet to ensure protection for students in schools, and including for student athletes in the context of interscholastic athletics. So obviously, inclusionary policies are great, and for the CIC and for school districts that are adopting inclusive policies and continuing to do the work to ensure that their policies remain inclusive. That's certainly the ideal. But where there may need to be some level of assurance, we have these statutes in place to ensure that there can be a mechanism for guaranteeing equality of opportunity to the extent that the law can do so.
Thanks, Mike. I'll ask you an unfair question, one that I would be annoyed if someone asked me if I were on a panel right now, but I'm going to ask it anyway.
Okay.
Get out your crystal ball for a moment, and if this, the issues that are in Seoul, the issues that you just fleshed out for us, what do you see in the future of the law of those issues if they were to move on to the Supreme Court? What do you think are some potential stumbling blocks for our goal of inclusiveness, and where do you think it could land?
Yeah, well, there's certainly a lot of conversation on a variety of issues. The Supreme Court is back in session after their summer break, the U.S. Supreme Court, and there's a lot of conversation that's been happening around the issues that the court has agreed to hear and what that means for what's called the conservative majority on the court. And so there's a lot of concern as a lot of kind of some of these issues, on a variety of issues come to the court, kind of what that's going to mean for how the court decides. With respect to something like Title IX that uses the term sex and kind of whether sex, how that encompasses gender identity as well, what I hope would happen is something a little like what we saw last year in the Bostock versus Clayton County case. Now that was not in the area of schools; it was in the area of employment. What the court held is that under Title VII, which is the federal employment discrimination statute, the main federal employment discrimination statute that prohibits discrimination in employment on the basis of sex, the court said that even though that law was passed in 1964. And at the time, perhaps, and this is a debatable point, that folks were not considering whether that would encompass trans folks, gender identity, sexual orientation. That in the way that it plays out, the word sex, now, sex discrimination, just textually and in terms of its plain language, is read to encompass discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. And that was a decision that was written with the support of two conservative justices, written by Justice Gorsuch, who has a very particular technical reading of our statutes. And so since then, the Biden administration has taken this position, a lot of advocates have taken this position, is that if you take that decision and apply what it holds, just going from the Title VII context and its discussion of sex to the Title IX context, that one-to-one translation, it should result in the same kind of idea that protections for sex discrimination should encompass, ensuring that folks can be protected on the basis of their gender identity as well. So that's certainly one thing that could be coming down the pike. That's certainly the outcome that I would hope to see is a decision that it ensures, that and kind of gives a federal U.S. Supreme Court stamp of approval to protections on the basis of gender identity. But I think what we're also going to see going forward is, having to, a lot of the questions that I get, in years past, a lot of the questions that I got from school districts, from individuals was, okay, how do we kind of navigate the law and ensure equal opportunity and full kind of access to our facilities for trans students? Students who at one time were, identifying themselves kind of to us, to the school district, in accordance with one gender, and now have indicated that in fact their gender identity and the way that they want to express themselves and identify is a different gender. And so they were kind of working on kind of ensuring that their policies and practices were squarely in accordance with what was required in that context. But now students are identifying not just as trans, but they're identifying as gender fluid, they're identifying as non-binary. And so a lot of the kind of practices that were put in place, which envisioned kind of going from one gender on the binary to the other gender on the binary, now have to kind of take account for the other ways that students are identifying. And our, like I said, our definition, is of gender identity in Connecticut is a broad one, and it's not limited to just cisgender, transgender. It's however somebody identifies. And so if students identify as gender fluid, as non-binary, agender, however it is that they may identify, our policies and practices have to ensure that they account for that. And I think that's going to be kind of another conversation. I've gotten more and more questions about that, and I think it's going to continue to be the case as the generation that's going through our schools is even more kind of inclusive and more rejecting of labels and boxes than my generation and generations
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thanks, Mike. So Glenn, I'll ask you a question, kind of spinning off what Mike just said. Gender is becoming a more fluid concept. I mean, I think it's Connecticut is embracing the idea, in the relative near future of an X gender identification on licenses, for example. And I think the standard that you laid out about how do you identify is going to become more blurry in the very near future. You're going to have high school students who have an X, for example, on their license. That's a government document. What does CIAC think about how that's going to play a role in sports, and how have you kind of given thought to, where we're headed?
Yeah, I think if by near future you mean yesterday, I agree.
Sure.
We're there, and that's one of the challenges that we face, and I think Diana mentioned this right at the beginning as well, is the just the small percentage and number of trans athletes, of non-binary athletes that we have, right? So in sport, we still have a binary system, and and that is a something that we probably could see not changing in the foreseeable future, that there's a binary system in sports. So I think the best way that we could honor that at this point, and to the the knowledge and the understanding that we have, is again working with kids to understand where is it that they most readily identify, or do they authentically identify at this time, while at the same point examining policies to see where can we can honor the fluidity aspect of the statutes that we have in Connecticut, and the way that people may may live their life. And that's where we are. You can, within state reporting right now to the State Department of Education, non-binary is a category. And so again, we're there, and we're there in public education, but not all aspects of society have caught up with that yet. So the larger, I guess kind of conversation is there enough to change the binary aspect of sport? And in our conversations with particularly one of the student athletes that I've had the pleasure of doing some presentations with, she had shared that where am I supposed to participate, and where am I supposed to run if I don't run with the girls? I can't run against one other person. That's not that's not fair to me. That's not competition. So that it's a challenge that we do have. It's upon us now, and I think right now we are being successful in having those conversations, authenticating where kids truly are living their life right now, and being able to continue providing those experiences in interscholastic sports.
And what does that process look like? Really the nuts and bolts of it, Glenn. I mean, is it an interview with the athlete? Is it something that you're relying on the school districts for? I mean, it seems like, as you're saying, it's a relatively small number of people. Is it a very individualized analysis, or are there standards you're using? What does it look like on a case by case?
It is a very individualized process, and we do rely on the school districts. Again, we want the kid in the schools to have those conversations and to understand the authenticity of how that student is identifying and where the best fit in terms of that identity lies. Because again, the sport experiences are an extension of the school day and the school curriculum, right? We can't say to a kid, I don't believe we can say to a kid, we're going to treat you, in this manner from 7:30 to 2 o'clock. But at 2:01 for sport purposes, well, we're going to treat you very different. So, we do rely on our schools having those conversations. Again, they involve the student, the parent. In many cases, they involve the student's counselors, maybe doctors that they're working with, because again, we want this to be something that is supportive of the student in understanding identity and using that as a manner to express who they are.
Thank you. Diana, I'll ask you a question. Kind of probably an awkward one with Glenn sitting right there, but I'm going to ask it anyway. What do you think of how Connecticut's handling trans athletes right now? What do you think they're doing well? What do you think they could do better?
Well, I think Connecticut is leading the way. Trying to do something better. I think, as everybody's been saying on this, we're doing a great job here in Connecticut. It's outside forces that are causing us to look at our policies, and it's not so much a trans athletes having the problem. It's certain groups within society that's having a problem with trans people, and they're very few. And so for a trans athlete, it's non-binary. As you said, they're working out things for non-binary students. We're working through the problem. We're not just folding our hands and saying no. We're actually having discussions on it. Even this discussion here, is enlightening. I've learned a lot, just by listening to everybody. And so I think what we're doing here in Connecticut is the right thing. We're caring about people and we're trying to make their lives better.
Thank you. I could, I'm extraordinarily curious about this topic. I could easily ask questions of you guys for the next 40 minutes. But let's open it up now to the audience. I don't think we've had any questions written in the chat, at least that I've noticed. But if anybody wants to ask a question, please go ahead. I will try to figure out who has their hand raised.
Jonathan Sykes has his hand raised.
All right, then. How about Jonathan Sykes?
Hi, good morning, all. I just want to thank you all. This has been a great panel so far. And I want to ask something that may be kind of controversial and provocative, but I feel like we've kind of tiptoed it around it through a lot of these discussions. And that is whether there is a future for sex-segregated sports at all. I feel like legal history has shown that segregation sort of relies on these notions that one group is sort of superior to another, and that is something that dovetails with the athletic conversation pretty substantially. I mean, the basic assumption is that, males and man identifying people are going to be somehow athletically superior to women and females. Is there a purpose to sort of maintaining this structure of sex segregation? And, it's good to sort of focus, I feel, on the athletic portion of it, but this really broadens out really far when it comes to trans people, because, who is mostly harmed by sex segregated bathrooms, for instance? It's going to be trans people, and it really goes further out. I know that some of the discussions in, some of the legal cases are, well, by mixing the sexes, we can eliminate scholarship opportunities for some women and everything like that. But we've also sort of discussed here today, about where does a non-binary person fit in this sort of sex segregated scheme. So I'm just curious for all of your thoughts as to, whether it's something worth pursuing to, dismantle sex segregation within sports, whether it's something that, should be maintained and sort of find a way to accommodate for the trans people out there, and just sort of what the future looks like on that. Thank you.
All right, so would ever like to speak on that?
Sure. I can jump in and probably give you the least satisfying answer that, maybe of the three of us here. But yes, it's a topic worth having discussions on. I think if you look at, physiological performance and you look back, we have, records set by, cisgender women today that outperform cisgender males from a decade ago, right? So we're starting to see the gap close in terms of gender performance at higher and more elite levels. That being said, I just, in my own personal opinion, I don't see the binary nature of sports drastically changing anytime in the in the near future. So that's where our efforts have really been on trying to understand and give people opportunities as much as we can to be inclusionary with that. So I think it certainly is worth the discussions, and I think they're valuable discussions, and I think we've seen those gender gaps shorten and in some places close, but I still think we're probably a good way away from seeing the binary nature of sports dissipate.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I think it's important to kind of consider the historical context sometimes, particularly when it comes to athletics. And one thing that John, you mentioned was kind of the segregation aspect in athletics. If we look back not too long ago, we had racially segregated sports in this country, and part of that was based on this notion that individuals of some races were kind of inherently better athletes than individuals of other races, and that notion has thankfully kind of, I think, in most respects, kind of gone away, and so now we have racially integrated sports. But it's we're not talking about the ancient past. This is within many of our lifetimes that was the case. So, and I think it's important to note that some aspects of the discussions that are still happening, even in the context of gender, are not totally detached from kind of the I think certain notions of that history. I think that we're not totally detached from that in the conversation that's happening now. But we also have to look at kind of the historical context that led to Title IX in the first place. The case that's pending now, the Sewell case, and what the different arguments are, kind of how Title IX should apply with respect to gender identity. Can you have a law that ensures kind of equal opportunities based on sex, and that even in some contexts kind of permits, although it doesn't require, but it permits, sex segregated teams? Can you have a way that to interpret that statute that it still accounts for equal opportunity and full participation in accordance with your gender identity? What the conversation is in that case is not about kind of the viability of Title IX and about the viability of those provisions going forward, because in part Title IX was created to correct a certain degree of imbalance. And even with Title IX having existed for decades now, we still see an imbalance in athletics when it comes to men's and women's sports. Even the NCAA is, they're currently undergoing their kind of equity study about how funding and resources are allocated. We see it in Major League Soccer, the difference between women's soccer and men's soccer, and how that is playing out. And so even with Title IX, we haven't achieved the full promise of that equality. And so I think that there's certainly, I think it we don't want to rush to kind of say, let's get rid of Title IX entirely and get rid of this kind of, ways of ensuring that there can be equality and equity in sports. But I think it's certainly an interesting question about kind of how maybe in some contexts for some sports, there might be a way of having kind of a scoring rubric or a metric that accounts for that, in a way that ensures kind of that the goals of what we're trying to accomplish without the exclusions of what some states and some contexts feel necessary to put into place.
Thank you. I'd seen, Meg, that we had another hand. I can't see the name, though.
Yes, I believe it was Deb Drexler.
All right. Deb. Is Deb still out there?
Yes, I'm still here.
All
My
right.
question was more about the role that science plays, both in the litigation aspect as well as arguments being made by the proponents and opponents of some of these issues. How is it all hormone based? Are the parties looking to utilize science in a particular way, or say, as we hear so often, science is not relevant, it's not real?
Well, I hope that's not our conclusion from this conversation, but I don't know if Diana, would you have anything to say about that? I think you're on mute, Diana. Just yeah. I'm still on mute, Diana.
Science, nobody really knows why we're trans. That's a $64,000 question. Why is a person trans? I think you can look at the same thing. Why are people left-handed? Nobody really knows. So science is still catching up to what we identify and how we identify. It's still lagging. There's all types of studies out there, but nothing has really showed what is the cause. They've functional brain scans have shown that our brains are different, but we only looked at trans people. We didn't look at 99% of the other population to see if their brains are the same, but we see a difference in trans people. And so science shouldn't count, because I don't think there will ever be a test to find out if you're trans or not. You can take blood samples, DNA, and everything else, but nothing will show that what's causing trans people. So there's no definitive test. You have to go by the person's word.
Yeah, I'm sorry, but I didn't mean like how you define or come to look at science as supporting or taking away from the identity of transgender, but how it's being used in terms of the argument that, well, if you have male hormones or you're biologically male, then you're going to be stronger, whatever the argument is, just as would be made in the racial segregation argument from, however many decades ago. That was my question. I didn't express it well. I apologize.
Okay. Well, kids into puberty, boys and girls are the same. There's really no difference. And once you get beyond puberty, then you find the changes. And I think, as has been said here, sports is more for educational purposes, not really, it's hard for me to express that, but it's not just being trans, it's being with other people and not how you identify. And science shouldn't count for that. It should be more up to the individual. Does that make sense? I'm a little bit past my field expertise, but
thank you for the answer.
Yeah.
And I think that I'm looking at the court cases and wondering where science is weighing in, how it's being used by the parties or abused by the parties.
Yeah, so Deb, if I could just throw in there as well, I think, when you're looking at the science end of it, I think we have to look deeper beyond, potentially what we've seen is outcomes, as Diana has mentioned, between the physiological differences post-puberty in cisgender males and cisgender females. I think the science, when it comes to looking at transgender inclusionary policies, largely rest in the findings of cisgender males versus cisgender females. They don't include transgender subjects. I think we're just on the precipice of starting to get a better understanding through scientific research of where transgender performance fits onto that spectrum. In the research that I conducted, there was a significant difference between transgender female performance and cisgender male performance. Cisgender males significantly outperform transgender females. So I don't think you can just compare a transgender female performance to a cisgender male. It's not, scientifically, I don't believe that that we can do that. I think the other challenge with the science behind it is those studies that have included transgender subjects have included elite subjects at that level. And, and many of those have included, very few of those have included transgender adolescents. So we're looking at collegiate or international elite level athletes who have been studied. When we're talking about the high school space, or we're talking about youth sports, right? Again, we're talking about 94% of the kids don't go on to that elite level. So, we don't really have any scientific research within the general community. I love the sport of tennis. I'm an avid tennis player. I don't want to get on a tennis court with Coco Gauff. It would not be, fun to watch. She would absolutely destroy me in a tennis match. And so, you can show me that science says there's a physiological advantage for, a cisgender male, let's just say in his 40s, to play against, a cisgender female in her, late teens, but that wouldn't hold true in that case. So until we have the scientific research that involves the demographics we're speaking about, not the elite kids, looking at youth. And one of the greatest challenges to that is there is not a significant number of transgender youth athletes to draw from to actually do these studies. So, I think it's, again, that those are the challenges. That's where we are, but that's where I think it's either used or misused in some of these court cases.
Thanks
Yeah,
very
Mike,
much.
can you speak to that? Are we seeing science in being used or misused in any of the current court cases going on?
Yeah, and I think what Diana and Glenn just said kind of all factors into the conversation that we're seeing with respect to kind of how the research writ large is coming into some of the litigation. I can speak more specifically to the litigation that I, the sole case that I represent, CHRO, and but also kind of in other similar cases around the country. Sports medicine, sports science is very much an active field, and I think research is happening all the time to try and figure out kind of what gives certain athletes an advantage over others. I think if you could pinpoint any individual thing, I think whoever did that would make a lot of money. If you could say this one thing is what kind of gives you an advantage over somebody else. I mean, I can remember just to my own days of studying, biology and learning about the different kind of muscle types that'll make some people better sprinters and some people better distance runners. And that can be kind of across gender identities, and so we see a lot of the what Diana mentioned before about somebody who is just naturally very tall, who is going to be a great center if they play basketball, but in another sport might be very much not the star of the team. I think some of the litigation, some of the ways that kind of research comes into play is, number one, I think some folks, particularly the folks who are trying to challenge the inclusive policies, are looking to, kind of one, sex correlated hormones, things like testosterone in particular, to say, there's a direct correlation. Higher testosterone, which you see in people who are assigned sex male and who aren't on kind of hormone blockers or haven't taken other kinds of gender affirming steps to kind of block that, inherent advantage necessary every time. But what we see is that doesn't directly play out, and there's a lot more to it than that. And what we see sometimes is that folks who in many different categories, many aspects, kind of identify and were assigned one particular sex, even if they're cisgender, they may have elevated levels of some of these hormones. And so what does that mean? If you have above a certain level, does that mean, at least for sports purposes, that you can no longer compete on this team, even if you are a cisgender individual who identifies in a particular way? Does that mean you can no longer compete? Has your own kind of natural hormone level excluded you from being able to participate in that way? There was the case of Caster Semenya at the Olympics in recent years, and kind of whether she was going to be allowed to participate in a particular way just based on hormone levels. And we also see research coming into play with respect to the real effects that exclusion can have on trans individuals, and particularly trans youth, as Diana mentioned before. That can't be totally kept out of the conversation, right? When we're talking about efforts and in some states, in some places, policies that result in this exclusion, that has a real effect, and that has a kind of tangible, verifiable, studyable, demonstrated effect. And so we see that coming into play as well. And so that kind of conversation is one that is happening as we speak. I don't think even as the court process continues across the country, we're seeing more and more decisions that at least are beginning to acknowledge the importance of respect for people's identities. But I don't think we'll ever be able to get to a place where there's one definitive decision, one definitive court decision that puts to rest the issue of gender identity, or even in the athletic space, kind of what gives somebody an advantage over another. I don't think that's potentially going to happen. I think we're just going to kind of continue to have these conversations, both in individual conversations, but also kind of in a larger national, legal policy conversation going forward.
Thank you, guys. Do we have any other questions, Meg? I don't see any hands, but maybe you do.
I don't see any hands, but I have my own question that I would like to ask the panel. And we also encourage people, if you do have questions, to write them in the chat or raise your hand, whichever you feel comfortable with. But I'll go ahead and ask my question. So we talked a lot today sort of about the law and about science. And a lot of people here have mentioned sort of the role of community. And earlier, Dr. Lungarini, you specifically mentioned this concept of how sometimes the way trans students are treated during the school day is kind of divorced from then how they're treated with regard to sports after school. What can members of the school community or members of the community at large do to be more inclusive with trans students and make sure that trans students are consistently encouraged and supported throughout all aspects of their education?
Yeah, thanks, Megan. First I would say in Connecticut we do it pretty well, and I'm proud of our member schools in Connecticut and the work that we do. But I think one of the things we can do is just like we do with many of the cases with our students, is raise their voice, give the opportunity for our trans students and our trans athletes to be heard, give them a platform in which they're supported to share who they are. In my experience, particularly, really diving into this topic over the last 3 years, I have been educated tremendously on a community that I didn't know and didn't understand, I think, much before that time. So, I think part of us embracing the inclusion of kids is in all aspects is really continuing to educate ourselves and maybe think also about when we put policies in place. I think one of the challenges that sometimes we have as policymakers and decision makers is we may put policies in place that on the surface appear supportive to the group that we're trying to target, but it may may be done in a way that it makes others feel comfortable, more comfortable as well. Am I putting something in place that says, okay, this is how we're going to support transgender kids, but really, is it supporting the concern or the fear that's that somebody else may have with accepting this change? So being intentional about the policies that we put in place to make sure that they truly are providing the support to the marginalized community that we're trying to offer that support to, I think is important for us in the future.
Thank you so much.
I think too, as well, to that point, it's important to, from, within the schools and school districts to really put into context kind of what it is that we're talking about when we talk about kind of the requirements, the obligations to respect and be inclusive of folks' gender identities, right? I think what I hear often in terms of kind of some situations that can arise is it seems to be this idea that it's on par with just kind of any passing notion that a kid may have. Kids, can move from one interest to the next, and maybe they're pretty good at code switching as well. From one group to another, and in different contexts. But there's a difference between this student identifies as, with she/her pronouns. She identifies as a girl. She goes by Jane. To that's in kind of a different category than well, it's Jenny this year. That's the preferred nickname, and but last year it was Jen, and sometimes teachers, rightly or wrongly can, well, this is what it says on the name, and they just they think it's optional. They think it's something that they can choose not to. And I say teachers, but in many instances, and you see this in the workplace as well, bosses, managers, they think it's an optional thing, but really it's not. If somebody begins kind of identifying themselves in a particular way and expressing that this is their preferred name, their preferred pronouns. This isn't just something that you can decide whether or not you want to honor. It's something that has to be respected. Exactly, as John said in the chat, it's not perfect. It's somebody's pronouns. Those are the pronouns that they use. I think that ensuring that that's not a kind of question is really as to whether you can be respectful in that way, I think goes a long way to ensuring kind of an overall area of inclusivity and ensuring that it follows through into the after school activities, right? In some instances, the coaches, the staff that kind of help with after school athletics, to coach the teams and assist in other ways. Sometimes they're teachers and staff at the school, and so they may be trained on kind of the school's policies, but sometimes they're volunteers. And so they may not necessarily be trained. I think it's important that they still be instructed on kind of what the school's policies are, what the school's kind of principles are, values when it comes to that, and the requirements, so that it follows through. That the rules don't go out the window as soon as 2 o'clock, or 2:01, as Glenn said, rolls around. It's still the school day, it's still the school environment, and the school is still responsible to ensure that those policies remain in effect.
Yeah, that kind of makes me an interesting question that I would have for Glenn. What kind of training are coaches receiving on this issue? Is there a formalized training they go through? Because I mean, it's one thing to have someone on a team, a trans athlete on a team. It's another thing to embrace them and support them and be a teammate and, you know, treat them as a part of the team. Our coach is going through a formalized process right now to train regarding that.
You know, the transgender policies that we have are part of a larger training that we do with coaches. So they do become familiar with our policies. We do talk to them about this within CAS and CIAC. We do a tremendous amount of work on diversity, equity, and inclusion. We have a student equity board as well, where this is a topic and a conversation that you know, we look at and expand beyond you know, just gender identity. We're also looking at diversity, equity, inclusion across the board. But this is a piece and a part of the conversation and the educational experiences that we're giving coaches and kids throughout this. In Connecticut itself, I think we have probably the strongest coaching education laws in the country. If you are not a certified teacher, there's a 45-hour clock class that you have to go to through to become get your permanent coaching certificate, and that certificate is renewed every 5 years. It requires 15 credits of continuing educational units to get that revision, and we do consistently look at how do we educate our coaches on the education-based values of interscholastic athletics and ensure that they know and fully understand CIAC bylaws and policies.
Any other questions from the audience before I ask my next question? They can jump right in. I have about 10 minutes left, so you're in the home stretch. If you have a question, now's the time. All right, so I'll ask this. You know, and I was doing, it's obviously part of my work, and I was doing some research and preparation, you know, for this conversation today, and the vast majority of the cases that I looked at all involved athletes of color, trans athletes of color. What role do you think race plays in this entire conversation?
Yeah, well, you know, in Connecticut, it involves trans athletes of color because they won. And so, you know, the spotlight was put on, you know, Terry and Andrea because they won. And, you know, I think that's there. I think if you know, look at the case of the wrestler in Texas, that's a white transgender male. I believe the cross-country runner in Idaho is a white transgender female. So, you know, where I think we have to be educated and knowledgeable. Diana mentioned this earlier. I mean, if we look at the incidence or the potential for suicide ideology, I think African American transgender or minority transgender individuals is one of the highest suicide rates in the country. So, you know, we have to know, educate, and understand how marginalized that community is and how they can be negatively impacted. But across the country, I don't think the transgender target is perhaps race-based. I do think that's gender-based. But our minority transgender individuals do have a fairly high incidence of suicide ideology, and we need to be aware and address that.
Yeah, so it's certainly it's kind of an inescapable kind of overlay of the conversation, even if it's not you know, directly the dynamic that's playing out in an individual case. I think you know, you oftentimes can't totally separate out protected classes, right? You know, if you know, I may be you know, gay, but also white, and so kind of the privilege that comes from one aspect, it does not go away, even though we're talking about maybe in the context of sexual orientation, there may not be that privilege. I think with the LGBT plus community overall, I think sometimes you see data in a kind of a homogenized way as like the block of the LGBT plus community. But then when you break it down, a lot of times you find that individuals who identify as LGBT plus, there's a difference between, perhaps particularly white male cisgender individuals and trans women of color. I think you can't totally kind of think of it as one kind of homogenized, demographic segment. And so when we're having conversations with respect to how some of this is playing out, I think you can't totally detach it. I think you have to kind of, like I said before, kind of think about some of the context that goes along with it, the inequity that still exists, that still pervades in a lot of instances that kind of may affect the opportunities that are there. When you're having conversations about who's even participating in a particular event, kind of what are the other building blocks, the other kind of aspects that led to who's even able to participate, who has the resources to be able to participate in that, and kind of what systems are in place to ensure that they are at the event, that they're able to do that. Who is kind of more looking for scholarships and in need of a scholarship, and who has kind of the privilege to be able to get to where they want to go, regardless of whether there's a scholarship involved. I think while it may not be kind of the main spotlight in every conversation when it comes to gender identity in athletics, I think it's in some ways intrinsic in the conversation, and can't be totally, like so many things in our country, you can't totally detach it, and it has to be kind of there, and kind of still borne in mind.
Great. Any thoughts on the issue, Diana? Anything you'd like to add? Sure, go ahead.
There we go. I just unmuted. Intersectionality is not just in sports. If you look at the number of trans people that were murdered this year because of their trans, it's almost all blacks. Socioeconomic status is also a big thing in discrimination. So when you have, when you look at how race, employment, and everything works together, it's really not additive, it's multitive. It's a lot bigger burden on somebody who's black or Latino. It's really hard on them. I know several trans people that they can't find jobs. So in education, we see the same thing probably, that students have a harder time because if they're a minority. And when you add on top of that, they're a minority who's also transgender, you're going to find out there's a lot of oppression against them.
Absolutely, yeah. And intersectionality is just such a huge part of the work we're doing in so many different areas of civil rights law right now. Thank you for calling that out. So everybody's to the audience, this is your last call. If you have any other thoughts, questions, comments, concerns, now is the time. Anyone else? All right, thank you. So to the panelists today, thank you so much for coming out. Thank you for being part of this conference. Thank you for your time and all of your thoughtful responses to my questions and to the questions of our audience. So thank you all very much. And hopefully we can continue this conversation in a positive way over the next few years.
Great. Thank you for the opportunity today. Appreciate it.
All right, thanks. And to the audience, be sure to take a look at your schedule and figure out what you're wanting to go to next. I do believe the next thing is going to be the lunchtime presentation. So that's the only thing that's going to be going on during that time. So be sure to log in there and then take a look at your schedules. You can find it at chro.gov or on any registration emails you were sent. So again, thank you to the panel. thank you to the audience. Y'all have a good day.
Yep. Thank you for having us on.